Right, well, let's get started back here. We'll have a few people coming in a little bit late. Maybe there was a long line at the coffee bar. All right. But there's some practical things that we can say about this. That we had an interesting conversation at break with, like how the Jehovah's Witnesses, for example, will take some of these passages like Leviticus 19:26 about the avoidance of blood altogether and how they would refuse in a hospital context or emergency room situation. You've been in those situations too where doctors can't do anything to help because they're not going to take blood, and it becomes a very difficult situation. So my basic response I'll just share with everybody was, or at least if I was having a conversation with someone who held that view, we're talking here, the Old Testament passages like what we just read in Leviticus are dealing with the religious context for how blood would be used or not used in a pagan kind of way. Of course, this is an emergency room situation, so maybe that would work, or maybe probably wouldn't, because Jehovah's Witnesses are pretty set in their ways. So, well, anyway, it's interesting though. We look at this slide and we talk about the laws of clean and unclean. Some of them that we've seen, and the practical aspects of are there to begin thinking like this, right? We're about the health of the community. So the protection of households and members of households have long-reaching implications for the community at large. Certain animals were avoided with regards to dietary laws of eating and not eating because of certain animals that were identified as those who carried diseases more than others. And against the protection against the pagan way of doing things. Some of those passages that relate to tattoos and beard grooming, for example, may have something to do with that. And again, guarding against the general spread of disease, but then basically promoting this general reverence for life. So limiting the eating of animals to certain ones, the details concerning how the blood of the animal that's being eaten is to be handled, and certain things like that. So that's what we can say generally. You have a lot of chapters here in Leviticus, just around the corner here, on dealing with, for example, leprosy. I think there's, where do they begin? Leviticus. Well, I think there's a good number of chapters here. Oh, it was before. That deal with how to deal with leprosy. Of course, in those days, yeah, I was jumping ahead. So chapter 14, a little bit of chapter 15, I think, and even back to chapter 13. So a few chapters all dealing with something that in those days was probably, and a lot more than it is now, very common. So common disease and ancient. So yeah, 2 full chapters dealing with leprosy. And if you think of chapter 16, the chapter that we looked at as the Day of Atonement chapter, that's a chapter that deals with one of the most, I don't know what the word would be, the most unclean thing of all, and that's human sin. So the Day of Atonement is also a chapter that in a way is dealing with clean and unclean, but in the case of human sin as being the grossest unclean of all. That's the offense against God and His holiness. All right, well, we continue on and we'll look at chapter 23. So let's look to Leviticus chapter 23. We kind of change gears now a little bit in terms of focusing on other ways that holiness was to be applied to the ebb and flow life of the community at large. And now we start to focus in on remember the concept cartoon, offerings and feasts. Now we're looking at what was in the right hand. So all of the feasts, the holy convocations, the gatherings, the ceremonies, and some of those things that start to be detailed out in the remaining chapters of Leviticus. The Sabbath, let's look at chapter 23, beginning in verse 1 through 3, and I'll have Spence. Could you read that for us?
The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, These are the appointed feasts of the Lord that you shall proclaim as holy convocations. My appointed feast. 6 days shall work be done, but on the 7th day is the Sabbath of solemn rest, a holy convocation. You shall do no work. It is a Sabbath to the Lord in all your dwelling places.
Okay, so here we're going to see the importance of the Sabbath principle. So that's you think of the Sabbath day of rest. This goes back to the 6, then 7 sequence of creation and the creation count back in Genesis chapter 2, verses 3 and 4. This is going to be foundational. Verse 3, this idea of the rest principle, as it is applied to a lot of different surprising aspects of the community, the faith community. So foundational for all of this is the Sabbath and the Sabbath principle or the rest principle. That's what we need to see here in verse 3. We'll see the Passover, the unleavened bread festival. This was the barley harvest in the spring. We're going to see the Feast of Weeks or the Pentecost 50 days later. In later spring will take place. We're going to see the Festival of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Tabernacles during the 7th month, later in September and October, right around the harvest of the grapes, figs, and olives. So let's see. Let's just move on to the first one. Let's look at, we'll see this 6th, then 7th principle, and then the 7th day of rest principle is going to be repeated in the cycles. We're going to see these repeated cycles of 7. 7's an interesting number that kind of shows up in how these festivals and convocations are defined and expressed. Every 7th day is a Sabbath day of rest, which will extend rest to the people, to the servants, the slaves, and the beasts of burden, which is interesting. Then we're going to have every 7th year, which will extend rest as a full year of rest for the crops that are being grown in the land. So the agricultural cycle will be implicated with this principle of rest. And then we have after 7 sevens of years, or 49, after 49 years, the 50th year becomes this year of Jubilee, where we'll see mortgaged lands are returned to the original family, which provides a rest for the economy, which is interesting. And then after the Passover, we have the Feast of Unleavened Bread. It's celebrated for 7 days. The Feast of Tabernacles is celebrated for 7 days. So we've got 7 holy convocations in all. So you see 7, 7, 7, 7, 7, 7, 7. 7's the number of completion. It's kind of the holy number you might think of. So that's on the foundation of all of this is the celebration of God as King. He's the sovereign ruler over all of the details of all of the aspects that we're going to be looking at with regards to celebrating the Sabbath and paying proper due diligence to honoring God as King is on the foundation and the backdrop of all of these festivals. All right, so let's look at a few of them here. So it's like chapter 23. Let's look at the first, the Feast of the Passover and the Unleavened Bread, here in verses 4 through 8. Keep reading there, Spence. 4 through 8 in chapter 23.
These are the appointed feasts of the Lord, the holy convocations which you shall proclaim at the appointed, or the time appointed for them. The first month, on the 14th day of the month at twilight, is the Lord's Passover. And on the 15th day of the same month is the Feast of Unleavened Bread to the Lord. For 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall have a holy convocation. You shall not do any ordinary work, but you shall present a food offering to the Lord for 7 days. On the 7th day is a holy convocation. You shall not do any ordinary work.
Okay, so this is the Feast of the Passover, unleavened bread. So this is going to remember Israel's unique status, having come out of Egypt, right? Rescued by the Lord and declared as a holy nation at Mount Sinai in remembrance. So this is an important holy convocation. Another one is verses 9 through 14. Let's see, Weston, could you read for us 9 through 14?
Yes.
Thank you.
The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land that I give you and reap its harvest, you shall bring the sheaf of the first fruits of your harvest to the priest, and he shall wave the sheaf before the Lord, so that you may be accepted. On the day after the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it. And on the day when you wave the sheaf, you shall offer a male lamb, a year old, without blemish, as a burnt offering to the Lord. And the grain offering with it shall be 2/10 of ephah of fine flour mixed with oil, a food offering to the Lord with a pleasing aroma. And the drink offering with it shall be of wine and a fourth of a hin. And you shall eat neither bread nor grain, parched or fresh, until the same day, until you have brought the offering of your God. It is a statute forever throughout your generations in all your dwellings."
So this is the first fruits offering. So this feast is focusing on God and recognizing God as the one who is really the one responsible for the successful crop harvest, and that it's truly from the Lord. The blessings of crops and the bounty is coming from him. We'll see this again in Deuteronomy 26. And this is a festival that's also including different kinds of offerings, burnt offerings, grain offerings, and a drink offering. And this is going to be important as Israel moves ahead. These repeating offerings or festivals, holy convocations, are important because they're going to be helpful in reminding everybody who's responsible for the surplus of bounty that we've received. Is it Baal? He's the fertility god of the Canaanites. Or is it the Lord? Oh yeah, it's the Lord. Let's get together and celebrate that. Bring in our first fruits and have a little backyard barbecue and remind ourselves of God's goodness. This is what the faith community was doing in those days. We were up in Bonham, Texas over the weekend. Everybody been to Bonham, Texas? Up almost to the border of Oklahoma. You get just past the urban sprawl of North Dallas up in McKinney. Up there where they've got that outdoor golf thing where you can go and rent a room and hit golf balls out in that. It's kind of like a sit and have, I guess drinks and stuff. But anyway, then they've got that outdoor place, not outdoor, but that place where you can go and do skydiving, through that air tunnel. It's just all up there. It's just crazy. What was I going with this? So Bonham. Oh yeah. We went up and visited my son's soon-to-be father-in-law's church, where he's a pastor in Bonham. And we went up there and we were able to break away from our church over in Mansfield to do this. So we drove up there an hour and a half and hung out with James's future family and had a wonderful time. But this was a small church, small Texas town, and everybody knows everybody, But really it was a treat because they were very loving people, very caring, Christ-focused community. And we were able to sit there in church, and we were recognized by Pastor Young. That's Abigail's dad. And Ellen was able to say this. She was thinking of something else, but she said, and you all are an answer to prayer because you all have been the crock pot that's cooked Abigail. And everybody got it because they all have been part of this, the community of faith working together to produce someone like Abigail, and we're so thankful for people like this in these kinds of little church communities. They're the ones that also produced guys like, we've talked about this. We'll talk about this next semester, but King David, those little faith communities that we see in the Old Testament. But they had this reason to get together after church. Everybody brought a casserole. You know what I'm talking about, in the crock pots, and everybody chipped in on the food, and we had this wonderful meal together. And we were able to continue to fellowship and all of that. So there's a real power to that. Larger churches have a hard time pulling off the old school potlucks after church. But here it was a church that still does it. And there was a chair for everybody, and it was really kind of reminded me of, in preparing this lesson and being reminded that this was what the households were doing, and bringing in even strangers and aliens and inviting them to the table. And as we'll see, not just, anyway, so it's reminded me of what you can pull off in a smaller church. There's power to those barbecues that you have. All right, 15 through 22. We'll look at this, and let's see. Could I have Lisa? Could you read for us in chapter 23, beginning in verse 15? The feast of the weeks or Pentecost, 15 through 22.
You shall count 7 full weeks from the day after the Sabbath, from the day that you brought the sheep of the wave offering. You shall count 50 days the day after the 7th Sabbath. Then you shall present a grain offering of new grain to the Lord. You shall bring from your dwelling places 2 loaves of bread to be waved, made of 2 tenths of an ephah. They shall be of fine flour, and they shall be baked with leaven, as first fruits to the Lord. And you shall present with the bread 7 lambs a year old without blemish, and 1 bull from the herd, and 2 rams. They shall be a burnt offering to the Lord, with their grain offering and their drink offerings, a food offering with a pleasing aroma to the Lord. And you shall offer 1 male goat for a sin offering, and 2 male lambs a year old as a sacrifice of peace offerings. And the priest shall wave them with the bread of the firstfruits as a wave offering before the Lord, with the 2 lambs. They shall be holy to the Lord for the priest. And you shall make a proclamation on the same day. You shall hold a holy convocation. You shall not do any ordinary work. It is a statute forever in all your dwelling places throughout your generations. And when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap your field right up to its edge, nor shall you gather the gleanings after your harvest. You shall leave them for the poor and for the sojourner. I am the Lord your God.
This is an important one, this Feast of Weeks, 15 through 22. It's going to occur 7 full weeks after the Feast of First Fruits. It's going to involve all different kinds of offerings, so wave offerings, burnt offerings, and fellowship offerings. In verse 22, it's just interesting. We start to see the broader benefit of these gatherings, these holy convocations. You see now who's involved in verse 22. This involves and this impacts the needy, the poor amongst the community, the aliens, the passer-throughs. Those are also involved in the rest that's given in terms of the harvest of the field. So you don't harvest certain parts of your field, so you're providing for the needs of your community. So all of this is important. Verse 23 and 25, we finally have a feast of trumpets. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the sons of Israel, saying, In the 7th month, on the 1st of the month, you shall have a rest, a reminder, by blowing of trumpets, a holy convocation. You shall not do any laborious work, but you shall present an offering by fire to the Lord. So this is the Feast of Trumpets, the first day of the 7th month. No work was involved except for blowing trumpets, and an offering was made. This was the blasting of the shofar, signified here. The blowing of the trumpet in the celebration here is the end of the agricultural year. So, there you go. But whenever you hear a trumpet blown, it's going to warn you or going to focus you on the Lord in some way. So that's what we have here. All right, well, let's keep going here. On the 10th day in verse 26 through 32, I won't read that, but it shows us the Day of Atonement is also on the 10th day of the same month is brought in to this cycle. Here we have this annual cycle of convocations and events going on. We already looked at the details in Leviticus 16 on the Day of Atonement. But the idea of and this is a picture of the goat that would be symbolic of taking the sins into the wilderness. And then finally we have the Feast of Tabernacles on the 15th day of the 7th month, verse 33 through 44. Let's see, could I have Amanda? Could you read that for us? Same chapter, verse 33. Until I tell you to stop here, we'll just get a little bit of it here.
And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the people of Israel, saying, On the 15th day of this 7th month, and for 7 days, is the Feast of Booths to the Lord. On the first day shall be a holy convocation. You shall not do any ordinary work. For 7 days you shall present food offerings to the Lord. On the 8th day you shall hold a holy convocation and present a food offering to the Lord. It is a solemn assembly. You should not do any ordinary work. These are the appointed feasts of the Lord, which you shall proclaim as times of holy convocation, for presenting to the Lord food offerings, burnt offerings and grain offerings, sacrifices and drink offerings, each on its proper day, besides the Lord's Sabbath, and besides your gifts, and besides all your vow offerings, and besides all your free will offerings, which you give to the Lord.
Go ahead and skip down to verse 42, and then read down to 44.
You shall dwell in booths for 7 days. All native Israelites shall dwell in booths, that your generations may know that I made the people of Israel dwell in booths when I brought them out of the land. I am the Lord your God. Thus Moses declared to the people of Israel the appointed feast of the Lord.
Okay, so this is an interesting celebration that involves the whole community, but as a way of historically remembering God's provision and the event of them out of Egypt, and then the beginning of the wilderness experience, getting out of Egypt. So this living in handmade booths or huts for 7 days. It's kind of a historical reenactment, if you've ever done that. We did a few of those in Boy Scouts. Over in Deuteronomy 16, this is also a little more details here that Moses gives with regards to the Feast of Tabernacles, chapter 16, verse 13. You shall celebrate the Feast of Booths, or Tabernacles, 7 days after you've gathered in from your threshing floor and your wine vat, and you shall rejoice in your feast. Notice the focus on rejoicing in this particular feast. But who does it involve? You see it in verse 14. You and your son and your daughter and your male and female servants. This is the household that's being described here. And the Levite and the stranger and the orphan and the widow who are in your towns. 7 days you'll celebrate a feast to the Lord your God in the place in which the Lord your God chooses, because the Lord your God will bless you in all your produce and all the work of your hands, so that you shall altogether be joyful. Joyful, joyful, joy. It's almost like this is the one festival that reminds me the most of Thanksgiving. We're giving thanks to the Lord. We're recognizing Him. What has He produced for us? He's behind the good earth that produces the things that are on our table. It's that recognition of the Lord and all that He's doing. It's really a recognition of Him as king, as sovereign over the entire community and providing for Israel. It's outreaching now to the poor, the orphans, the widows, and the strangers who are also brought in to participate. It's kind of a holy convocation that has evangelistic implications as well, which is really interesting. So let's see. That's all I want to say there. So this principle of Sabbath, so we're getting near the end here, is being applied now, not just to rest for the people, but it's now going to show up with regards to rest for the agricultural side of things in Israel, as well as Israel's economy. So chapter 25, I want to look at just a few verses here that talk about this. Chapter 25, beginning in verse 1. Then the Lord spoke to Moses at Mount Sinai, saying, Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, When you come into the land which I shall give you, then the land shall have a Sabbath to the Lord. So here's what the Sabbath looks like for the land. 6 years you'll sow your field, and 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather in its crop. But during the 7th year, the land shall have a Sabbath rest, a Sabbath to the Lord. You shall not sow your field nor prune your vineyard. Your harvest aftergrowth you shall not reap, and your grapes of untrimmed vines you shall not gather. The land shall have a sabbatical year, and all of you shall have the Sabbath products of the land for food. Yourself and your male and female slaves, and your hired man and your foreign resident, and those who live as aliens with you. Even your cattle and your animals that are in your land shall have all of its crops to eat. Now, what's interesting here, it's This is rest that's now applied to the land. It involves the poor and the needy, orphan, widow, helpless, stranger, and alien. But this one's to the land, right? We've already seen how the rest is applied to those other groups. So 6 years of harvest, 1 full year of rest for the land. Crops were to be stored up in anticipation and shared amongst all who were part of the household. Now servants, slaves, and foreign residents, aliens, everyone living next door, and all the beasts of burden as well would benefit from this year of rest. They're not going to be out there working the land. You're going to give them, your livestock, your beast of burden, a full year of rest as well. Now this sounds really kind of clunky, doesn't it? If you think you're a farmer, you're trying to be competitive with those around or other nations perhaps. I mean, this is a little bit risky. A full year of not planting anything? Really? But what are some of the things that forces this and the faithful community to do? It reminds them who's ultimately in charge of producing the bounty that we need to provide for all of us. We can't grow crops for 1 full year, but what happens during years 1 through 6, right? God's over and abundant. He's providing more than enough for us during those 6 years. Not only for us, but for everybody else that passes through in our animals, our beasts of burden, and all of this. So this is as a reminder that God's people can wait on Him for provision. It's a reminder that they're dependent on Him for producing the bounty that they need. There's a spiritual benefit for us when we apply this principle to our lives. So the principle of rest, it's for the people. It's not a year of inactivity, but it's a chance for them to not be out in the fields working all the time, but to focus on the Lord. Like a sabbatical year where professors sometimes get sabbaticals so they can not necessarily be in the classroom grading papers or doing administration, but they're out in the library digging in and doing research so they can write their next book. So that's the sabbatical principle applied for seminaries. But here's another thing that allows and it impacts. Israel's economic cycle will also be interrupted with this principle of rest. All of those working the land will rest, focus on the Lord, and have time to focus on the things that really matter. So this is a principle that spiritually is applied. When we're not out there working and doing things, we're able to give our brains and our spiritual lives rest as well, so we can focus on the Lord as well. If you think about what are the benefits for the land itself, so if we're not out there toiling and digging up the soil and planting seeds, have you ever heard of this principle called letting the land fallow or go to fallow? So you're just letting it do its thing. And interesting that when that happens, you farmers out there, there's just one in the room, but that allows the microbes or the decay that takes place in the soil. It allows the soil to do its thing. So if you're not messing around with the soil, putting stress on the soil is able to rejuvenate itself. So at the microbial level, little did Moses know at the time, giving land a chance to replenish itself through this year of rest. It allows the nutrients to replenish the nitrogen in the soil through the microbes that are producing the nitrogen, breaking things down, all those benefits. Insects such as earthworms also help loosen the soil, and all those natural things God's perfect design, right, is allowed to happen. Man's not interfering with, trying to take on the role of God, adding a bunch of extra stuff to the land. So there's really, it really gets into, some interesting discussions. So this is the Sabbath principle. Now I've got a buddy who's in my Sunday school class with regards to the economy. So how this Sabbath principle is applied to his business. He oversees 3 Chick-fil-A's. in the Mansfield area. This is a guy in my Sunday school class. And he'll tell you, not to be boastful or proud, but he'll say, yeah, Chick-fil-A's closed on Sunday completely. You know that, right? But it's interesting, if you look at the Chick-fil-A's, wherever they're located, they're closed for one full day a week. They're only open for 6 days. Every other restaurant around them typically is open for 7. But who's taken home more income from production of the little chicken sandwiches? You look at the charts, they outdo by far any of the restaurants that are around them. It's just crazy. Yeah, the dollars and cents of it don't make sense. You think that, oh, we got to be competitive. We got to stay, open, 7 days a week. So it's an interesting principle that they've written into their business business activity. So the Sabbath principle is also applied to the economy in the Israelite culture. Let's look at chapter 25, beginning in verse 8. So now we're getting into we're moving away from the land. We see the benefits of the land and the Sabbath principle as it's applied to the 6th and 7 principle for the agricultural cycle. Now what's it look like a little more close to the business cycle with regards to Israel's workaday world? So chapter 25, looking at beginning of verse 8. So here's what it looks like. You are to count off 7 Sabbaths of years for yourself, 7 times 7 years, so that you have the time of the 7 Sabbaths of years, namely 49 years. Then you shall sound the ram's horn abroad on the 10th day of the 7th month, on the day of atonement. You shall sound the horn all through your land. You shall thus consecrate the 50th year and proclaim a release through the land to all of its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you. This is the year of Jubilee. And each of you shall return to his own property. And each of you shall return to his family. You shall have the 50th year as a jubilee. You shall not sow, nor reap its aftergrowth, nor gather in from its untrimmed vines. For it is a jubilee. It shall be holy to you. You shall eat its crops out of the field. On this year of Jubilee, each of you shall return to his own property. So here's what it looks like. 7 sabbatical years of the land, and this is the 49, and then that 50th year, the sound of the horn, and a release is proclaimed for the land and the servants or slaves who are serving in the land, a release of ownership. In other words, so I'm working for a household A, working off debt or whatever, and on that year I'm allowed to, by choice, if it's something I want to do, is to go back and return to my former household. Or if the land is being leased out in any way or borrowed or whatever, it's going to go back on this particular year. It's going to return back to its original owner. So what is the net effect of this? It's providing a rest for the economy, which potentially could be built on the backs of the poor and needy, but not in the case of Israel. So you're not going to have anybody permanently owned. You're not going to be, land ownership is going to be defined and maintained, and it's not going to be potentially building this economy of debt. In other words, owing somebody, and that's not the economy that's going to be the primary substance for Israel. Israel's economy is not an economy built on debt. It's not an economy built on I owe you. So it's built on the over and abundance in the provision of the Lord. So it's not an economy that's propped up on the backs of the poor. So people who can be manipulated and kept down and suppressed based on debt or poverty. This is not going to be the economy that's part of Israel. So that's radical and revolutionary today. Now we're gonna before we break for the day. I think I'll let you out early today after I finish just a few more slides. So we won't take a break at the top of the hour. Is that fair? Okay. So what else was important for this Sabbath principle? Let's look at Leviticus 26, beginning in verse 33. This also overlaps with the land. So this principle, the Sabbath principle, is important because it's going to have far-reaching implications. Chapter 26, verse 33. Let's have, let's see here. Andrew, could you read for us in 33 through 35?
And I will scatter you among the nations, and I will unsheath the sword after you, and your land shall be desolation, and your cities shall be a waste. Then the land shall enjoy its Sabbaths as long as it lies desolate. While you are in your enemy's land, then the land shall rest and enjoy its Sabbaths. As long as it lies desolate, it shall have rest, and the rest that it did not have on your Sabbaths when you were dwelling in it.
While you were living in it, the land which you're resting, the land that you're living in, while you were living in it, and it did not observe, or you did not observe your Sabbaths. So this idea of desolation, we'll pick it up in, turn to Jeremiah chapter 29. What's interesting about this is the prophet Jeremiah is going to recognize something significant about this, you might say, violation of the Sabbath principle. And Jeremiah is writing in this particular chapter, he's writing to the exiles, and here's what he does, it is explain something. For thus says the Lord, when 70 years have been completed for Babylon, I will visit you and fulfill my good word to you to bring you back from this place. So this 70 years of being in exile for Jeremiah is this 70 years of exile because of the violation of God's people, his own people, and their rebellion against, for example here, the principle of the Sabbath rest. What they've been doing all these years is not practicing the Sabbath, but they've been practicing and getting really good at being pagans. So this practicing of idolatry amongst God's own people and their rebellion against him, now this principle of Sabbath will be applied to the land to kind of, you might say, make up for time lost. We have some other places to go to in terms of how Israel, when they get into the land and down the road a bit, how well were they doing with regards to applying this Sabbath principle? We've got some clues. Let's turn to the prophet Amos. The prophet Amos. Amos chapter 8. Oops. Amos chapter 8, beginning in verse 4. There we go. So the prophet Amos is, he's the prophet of injustice with regards to Israel, the northern nation. And he's charging them in verse 4. Hear this, you who trample the needy, to do away with the humble of the land, saying, and he's quoting them, when will the new moon be over so that we may sell grain, and the Sabbath be over, that we may open the wheat market to make the bushel smaller and the shekel bigger, and to cheat with dishonest scales, so as to buy the helpless for the money and the needy for a pair of sandals, and that we may sell the refuse of the wheat. The Lord has sworn by the pride of Jacob, indeed, I'll never forget in any of their deeds. Because of this, will not the land quake, and everyone who dwells in it will mourn? Indeed, all of it will rise up like the Nile, and it will be tossed about and subside like the Nile of Egypt. And what will he do with their holy congregations, holy convocations. Verse 10, then I'll turn your festivals into mourning and all your songs into lamentation. And I'll bring sackcloth on everyone's loins and baldness on every head, and I will make it like a time of mourning for an only son at the end of it. And at the end of it, it will be like a bitter day. So this is Amos's charge here, and the prophet is, you see some of the echoes of what we looked at earlier with regards to how Israel is supposed to be fair in their business practices and how they're weighing things on the city streets and exchanging goods on the city streets and all of that. And their attitude towards the Sabbath, you saw that in verse 5. They can't wait for it to be over. In fact, they'd rather not celebrate it. In fact, let's just decide this. Let's keep our Chick-fil-A open on Sunday, because that way we'll make more money for ourselves. Because if we have one more day during the week where we're not practicing the Sabbath, according to Amos, this is the attitude and the attitude in Israel in the north, it'll be one more day for us to take full advantage of the poor and needy with our dishonest scales and selling the refuse of the wheat. In other words, filling our bags not just with the pure kernel of wheat, but with the char, right? The extra stuff that adds weight to the bag, but it's not edible, But we'll throw that in there because then we'll get more money for our wheat. We're selling refuse in the place. So this is the attitude of the Sabbath, and according to Jeremiah that we saw, with this kind of attitude and this direct opposition to the Sabbath day of rest, God will decide to give the land its Sabbath day of rest from its own people. Don't have any people around, that'll force the Sabbath day of rest principle anyway, until I'm ready to bring my people home. So this was the opposite of the way things should have looked in Israel with regards to the Sabbath day of rest. The nations should have been watching and observing and seeing a booming economy despite the practice of the Sabbath day of rest dropped in. And this is not, in other words, this is by Amos's time, this is the opposite of what Israel is demonstrating to the watching world. So Israel was supposed to be an economy that was fully capable of taking care of the poor and the needy around them. The bumper crops that the Lord would be producing for them in response to the obedience of God's people was going to be amply enough for providing for and caring for the needs of the orphans, the widows, and even the strangers coming in. There was no cheating involved. It was not necessary. They would have been experiencing the bounty of the Lord all the time and being constantly reminded of the Lord's provision with every celebration of the Holy Convocation, whichever festival it was, dropped into the agricultural cycle of an entire year. Israel was continually supposed to be reminding themselves of the Lord's provision with so many of these convocations that we've seen. So that's what we were hoping for in the Promised Land. And let's see. Let's look at Deuteronomy chapter 16. And I think I mentioned this earlier in chapter 16, and what we'll see Moses expanding on with regards to the particular celebration of the festival of booths. Here we have the Feast of Booths here in chapter 16, beginning in verse 13. And there's an interesting connection that I want to draw here before we close for the day. Ye shall celebrate the Feast of Booths. So this is verse 13. 7 days after ye have gathered in from your threshing floor and your wine vat. So this is totally tied in with the harvest cycle each year. And you shall rejoice in your feast. Who's going to rejoice? You and your son and your daughter and your male and female servants and the Levites and the stranger, the outsider and the orphan, the widow who are in your towns. How long? 7 days you shall celebrate a feast to the Lord your God in the place which the Lord your God chooses, because the Lord your God will bless you in all of your produce and in all the work of your hands, so that you shall altogether be joyful. So this is a festival celebration based on the agricultural harvest cycle. It's a celebration that focuses directly attention on God, the provider, God who's provided amply, so we can do this and provide for all of these people. Now, how well will Israel do with this particular celebration down the road in her history? Let's turn to Nehemiah chapter 13. Nehemiah chapter 13, beginning in verse 15. And in this context, we would have been hopeful and maybe expecting to see a changed attitude with regards to these festivals, because the covenant community is being restored as God's faithful have come out of the Babylonian captivity after the 70 years is over to rebuild the temple and the walls around Jerusalem and rebuild the covenant community. But Nehemiah is going to charge in chapter 13, verse 15. He says, "In those days I saw in Judah some who were trading wine presses on the Sabbath and bringing in sacks of grain and loading them on donkeys, as well as wine, grapes, figs, and all kinds of loads. And they brought them into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. So I admonished them on the day that they sold food." Down through verse 18. "Also men of Tyre were living there, who imported fish and all kinds of merchandise and sold them to the sons of Judah on the Sabbath, even in Jerusalem. Then I reprimanded the nobles of Judah and said to them, 'What is this evil thing you are doing and by profaning the Sabbath day? Did not your fathers do the same thing, so that our God brought on us and on this city all this trouble?'" AKA the forced Sabbath, right? That we saw Jeremiah talk about. "Yet you are adding to the wrath on Israel by profaning the Sabbath." So how important is the Sabbath day of rest? Or the Sabbath principle being applied in all of these various ways? Whether it be helping the individual faithful member, the benefit of rest for his household, other servants and people working the fields, the beast of burden in the fields, the land itself, and the economic cycle that we see with the returning of things owned and property, whether it be land or people who are giving themselves over for service for a time, being free to return back to their proper household. All of this is part of the Sabbath principle that's being applied. It's not just one day a week, but it's fully comprehensive. And what's interesting is where this principle goes into the future. This particular feast or festival, the Feast of Booths, let's turn to remind ourselves of where this will go in an interesting way, I think. Let's turn to the prophet Zechariah. Turn to the prophet Zechariah. We just read that passage in Nehemiah, who, he's kind of being critical of the people and their irresponsibility with regards to the practicing of the festival and the principle of the Sabbath. But look what happens in Zechariah. Here we go. Sorry, Zechariah, chapter 14, and what we have here in Zechariah is the prophet. One of them, Zechariah and Haggai, are at least two of those prophets that are called by God to come back and prophesy as a means of to this post-exilic audience. So again, the group that's come back after the 70 years in exile, they're being encouraged by these prophets like Haggai and Zechariah. And what we have here in Zechariah 14, here at the end, this is the focus on the day of the Lord and some significant things that are happening on the day of the Lord. Remember, we talked about this in our bookend discussion at the very beginning of this semester. Verse 1, "Behold, a day is coming for the Lord when the spoil taken from you will be divided divided them up among you. This day of the Lord, let's look at skip down to verse 7. The day. So what will it be like? Prophet Zechariah says, "For it will be a unique day which is known to the Lord, neither day nor night, but it will come about that at evening time there will be light, and it will come about in that day that living waters will flow out of Jerusalem, half of them towards the east, half of them towards the west. It will be as the same as in summer as in winter." In verse 9, "And the Lord Yahweh will be king over all the earth. In that day, the Lord Yahweh will be the only one. And his name," right? The only one. Remember, name means reputation. So the fullness of everything about who Yahweh is will be fully experienced and recognized by everyone who's there. And now we see it's including the nations who will also be part of this. Keep going down to... move over to verse 16. So here's the significant recognition of the Feast of Booths. "Then it will come about that any who are left amongst all the nations that went against Jerusalem will go up from year to year." What will they do? Well, they'll worship the King of the Lord, Yahweh of hosts, and celebrate the Feast of Booths. That's interesting because we saw that this particular convocation, this gathering, included people from the outside. The strangers were invited in to sit around the table and to be there to see physically, here's the representation of the bounty of the Lord. I'm inviting you in. Let's celebrate. So if I went up to Bonham and sitting around the table, the church would say, "Hey, we're inviting in a few extra people from outside. Homeless Joe around the corner, we're inviting him to the backyard to celebrate today. He's an outsider, he's a stranger, but today he's part of us because he's going to see and witness firsthand the bounty of the Lord and the provision." But here it is on the day of the Lord to celebrate the Feast of Booths. And it's interesting because so there's this, the implication there is the nations will be involved. Those on the outside will be involved with the Jews in terms of going up to Jerusalem to do these kinds of things. So it's a recognition, obviously, of God, the Lord as King, according to verse 16, but also the celebration of the Feast of Booths, which is a recognition, again, of his goodness and his provision with regards to the agricultural cycle. So really, this is the last thing I want to say about the book of Leviticus. It's kind of a goofy, old-fashioned picture, but it's the walking billboard idea that I just want to make sure that we kind of understand. So what is kind of the driving, kind of unifying idea behind all of these teachings, these instructions that we've seen, these details that oftentimes get overlooked when we read a book like Leviticus? Well, Israel is supposed to be a radical nation and showing off, you might say, the fullness of the name, which means reputation, of their God. They were supposed to look different, act different, eat different, raise their kids in a different way, maintain and manage their households in a different way. And the overflow of their relationship with the Lord was to permeate every nook and cranny of Israelite society, whether it be what's happening on the street with the sale and exchange of goods, how you're baking your bread in your ovens at home and in a certain way, not like the pagans would, but there's a radically different way of making bread, perhaps, based on what Moses is hearing from the Lord and instructing Israel. So, so this idea of being a walking billboard for the Lord is, I think, probably a better way of understanding why all the details of a book like Leviticus. I just don't understand it. But if you have this in the backdrop, before you approach a book like this, it's got a lot to say. And, some of the challenge is for us when we teach and preach from a book like Leviticus is, what do we do with these laws? Well, if you think of them as instruction, and we take our work, the work of interpretation, seriously, let me encourage you to think of it this way. Coming up with what's called a timeless principle, in other words, recognizing that This is something that for then and for that audience, for Moses standing in front of Israel at Mount Sinai, giving this instruction would have made total and complete sense to them. Well, cultures have changed in some ways, but what's the timeless walkaway, right? Is there a timeless principle for eating a certain way? Is there a timeless principle for how I raise my children a certain way? Is there a timeless principle for, did I say eating? Yeah, health restrictions and maintaining health and purity within the laws of clean and unclean. How do I treat a wound properly? Yeah, there's certain timeless principles for that. We have certain ways of doing that and putting feet to those things. And this, as time has moved ahead, as technology has improved in some of those things. So it's the challenge of coming up with timeless principles that I think is something that we can do more of when we are teaching or preaching from a book like Leviticus here. So, all right. Well, I don't want to jump